Event today includes a lineup of two extremely qualified speakers in their subject areas who will be speaking on the erasure of Indigenous rights and Indian settler colonialism in Kashmir, and similarly, how the Palestinians have been engaged in a constant struggle to preserve their rights and achieve national liberation under Israeli settler colonialism. Throughout today's program, we'll also be sharing the results of ICNA's Council for Social Justice Bay Area Chapter's Art and Writing Competition, which was a competition that was put on for Bay Area youth to commemorate the International Day of World's Indigenous People. And with that brief introduction, we are going to transition now to opening our event with a Quran recitation. And so I will pass the mic over to Brother Ziad, I believe.
Thank you, Sister Iman. So, inshallah, I'm going to be reciting from Surah Nisa, verse 75 to 77. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وما لكم لا تقاتلون في سبيل الله والمستضعفين من الرجال والنساء والولدان الذين يقولون ربنا أخرجنا من هذه القرية الظالم أهلها واجعل لنا من لدنك وليا واجعل لنا من لدنك نصيرا الذين آمنوا يقاتلون في سبيل الله والذين كفروا يقاتلون في سبيل الطاغوت فقاتلوا أولياء الشيطان إن كيد الشيطان كان ضعيفا ألم تر إلى الذين قيل لهم كفوا أيديكم وأقيموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة فلما كتب عليهم القتال إذا فريق منهم يخشون الناس كخشية الله أو أشد خشية وقالوا ربنا لم كتبت علينا القتال لولا أخرتنا إلى أجل قريب قل متاع الدنيا قليل والآخرة خير لمن اتقى ولا تظلمون فتيلا صدق الله العظيم. Inshallah, I'm going to do a quick translation. And what is the matter with you that you do not fight in the cause of Allah and for the oppressed among men, women, and children who say, Our Lord, take us out of the city of oppressive people and appoint for us from yourself a protector and appoint for us from yourself a helper. Those who believe fight in the cause of Allah, and those who disbelieve fight in the cause of any entity. So fight against the allies of Shaitan. Indeed, the plot of Shaitan has ever been weak. Have you not seen those who were told, restrain your hands from fighting and establish prayer and give zakah? But then when fighting was ordained for them, at once a party of them feared as they fear Allah, or with even greater fear. They said, Our Lord, why have you decreed upon us fighting? If only you had postponed it for us for a short time. Say, the enjoyment of this world is little, and the hereafter is better for he who fears Allah, and injustice will not be done to you even as much as a thread inside of a date seed. So that is it for the Quran recitation.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Ziad, for sharing those really relevant ayat with us today. And in transitioning to the next piece of our program, we are going to be announcing the 5th place and 4th place entries in the art and writing competition. And so in 5th place, we have Munib Farouk's essay titled The History of Islam and Muslims in Kashmir. And we'll be putting that up on the screen for you all to see.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. My name is Munib Farouk Abdul-Raqib and I am a senior in high school. For this competition, I wrote on the history of Islam and Muslims in Kashmir. The world thinks that Kashmir's history starts in 1947 when the partition of India and Pakistan happened. But looking into their depths and to the heart of Kashmir, you see a golden age of over 5,000 years of history. The reason Kashmir history is unknown is due to the lack of political representation. Over the past 5 millennia, Kashmir has been ruled by kings from various faith groups: Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Afghans, Sikhs, Dogras. While the ruling clans kept changing, a large number of Kashmiris in the past 1,000 years continued to feel they were unrepresented and suppressed. Being ruled by so many different religions and backgrounds, a question comes to mind as to how did it embrace so many Muslims, and what brought it to the rise of Islam in many parts of Kashmir. Well, Islam was introduced to the Kashmiris by a massive increase of Muslim Sufis from Central Asia and Persia, starting around the early 14th century. Moreover, the early history of Islam not only had Sufis, but also featured a Mongol warlord, an Afghan Hindu minister, and Buddhist refugee turned king.
All right, and announcing the fourth place piece, we have an art piece by Sister Husna Bashir Ahmed, and you should see that on your screens as well.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Husna and I'm in 8th grade. As you are aware, our fellow Muslims in Palestine and Kashmir have been facing oppression for more than 50 years. Their rights have been taken away from them and hundreds of innocent people have been killed. But no matter how hard the occupiers try to silence them, they still stand with courage and fight against them. I tried to convey all of this through my artwork by drawing a closed fist that represents the people's strength against oppression. It also represents a strong determination for liberation. The flags bleeding down the fist represent the innocent people who have lost their lives during the struggle. I hope my artwork spreads awareness and reminds people of the ongoing struggle in Palestine and Kashmir. Jazakallahu khairan.
It's so amazing to see the expression of our youth and ensuring that these causes remain something important to our communities, and making sure that we know the history of those struggles. And so I'm glad to see the results of this competition, and glad that we have a platform to share them with you all today. And so for the next part of our presentation, we'll have Professor Zia speak. And Professor Zia is a, mashallah, very accomplished speaker. She's a PhD, and as a political anthropologist, she's a poet, a short fiction writer, a columnist, professor at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. She is the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir. She is also been featured in the Feminist 2021, which is a list of 100 women from the Global South working on critical issues. She's the co-editor of Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak, and Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, and A Desolation Called Peace. She has published a poetry collection called The Frame and has another collection forthcoming. She is also the founder and editor of Kashmir Lit, and is the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, which is an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. And Professor Zia will be speaking on the erasure of Indigenous rights and Indian settler colonialism in Kashmir. So if you can join me in welcoming Professor Zia today.
Thank you so much, Iman, for that extensive introduction. And thank you to the organizers of this program. I'm really honored to be here and to speak about Kashmir today, especially because we're talking about indigeneity, we're talking about indigenous peoples. So I think it's very important for us, one, to look at these two struggles that we are talking about today, Kashmir and Palestine together, as similar but not same. We do have to keep that in mind as we're speaking and talking and thinking through these different lenses that we are using today. The other thing I also want to reiterate is that when we think about the International or World Indigenous Peoples Day that was celebrated August 9th, observed August 9th, 2021, one of the slogans, or maybe the only slogan that it had was that leaving no one behind. And also, this is a call for new social contract. And I think that should really, for all of us who are thinking about these problems, it should allow us to rethink our own problems that we've been thinking through different lenses. But this is something that we really need to consider. Like, what's this new social contract? And what does it mean to leave no one behind? For the longest possible time, if you think about the last 74 years since 1947, you just mentioned the paper that we were listening to, that one of the students, I forget his name, who's written about Islam's history in Kashmir. He mentioned the partition of India. I think these are the things that we have to start considering. Like, what do we mean by partition? Is it a term that we should be using to describe this particular scenario? And I'm not negating any history. I'm not negating the violence of partition, quote unquote. But we also have to think in terms of like, whose partition? When we say partition of India, and I'll come back to indigeneity because this is really connected to that. So when we think about partition of India, it looks like this huge swath of deep historic continuity that has happened till 1947 of some India. And then suddenly it was partitioned. Of course, there was a diversion and diversification and compartmentalization of two peoples that kind of wanted a different homeland for each. But I really like to think about this as creation of two countries rather than partition of India. Thinking about what was India before 1947, it wasn't the India that it is claiming today. It was British India. It was a dominion that was created out of princely states. And many of those princely states were in different kind of relationships with the crown, the British crown at that time. So the reason I kind of bring this up is, and connected to what I have to say, is because when we think about indigeneity, we think about who are the indigenous people. That kind of changes when we're thinking about post-colonial nations. And so that's something that we have to consider. Like, do we want to call it partition and not question why we are calling it a partition? Because despite the immense loss of millions of lives and also snatching and erasures of histories that happened during that event, it's also a creation of two countries in a way, and which brought about that violence to all of these peoples. And that kind of affects Kashmir as well. That has a huge influence on what's happening in Kashmir right now. The other thing that I want to talk about is what's happening to Kashmir in the aftermath of August 5th, 2019, because we are talking about erasure of indigeneity, indigenous rights. I'm really happy to be speaking about Kashmir through the rubric of indigenous peoples and indigenous rights, because what has happened to Kashmir in the last 74 years is that it has been subsumed by the Indian narrative mostly to such levels that in this current moment, India likes to tell the world that it is a law and order problem. It's a domestic problem. And when it wants to sell it on a bigger platform, then it becomes a terrorism problem, and it becomes a proxy war, and it becomes a territorial issue. But that's not what Kashmir is. And that's where thinking through the lens of indigenous rights and indigenous people helps us think about Kashmiris who have been the most important stakeholder in this issue, but have not been taken cognizance of for the last 74 years. It's not as if Kashmiris have not spoken. It's not as if Kashmiris have not written, but their struggle has been subsumed for the last 74 years by the two dominant nations. And the other thing, when I talked about earlier, when we think about indigenous, when we think about leaving no one behind, this new social contract. So when we think about post-coloniality, like after 1947, when there is creation of two countries, there is this diktat that happens upon indigenous peoples that you either have to join Pakistan or have to join India. Let's not even think about Kashmiris. Let's think about other parts of British India and princely states, because there are other peoples in there as well. What are the kind of violences that were wreaked upon them? And if Kashmir is speaking today, we don't hear whispers of those struggles that happened around 1947 at that time. So the violences of this post-colonial conditions that were put on these peoples is something that we need to think about. And what is this rethinking of social contract? The rethinking of social contract is basically early on, when you think about 1947, there was a contract between big dominant nations. But now the contract has to kind of distill to the peoples. And I think that's what this year's World Indigenous Peoples Day was marking, that this contract has to trickle down. It has to go down to these people who are actually affected by these large and big decisions. So then also thinking about Indigenous rights and genuine participation in a political system. If you think about Kashmir, where is the genuine participation? There has never been a genuine participation of Kashmiris in the politics that took place after 1947. And also in that we see weaponization of the most effective tool that was transported to this part of the world, which is quote unquote democracy, Western liberal democracy. We see weaponization of that. And that's very, very important for us to consider. Today, when we think about Kashmiris, it's almost like Kashmiris, when we think about their struggles, not us per se, but a lot of other people, it's very easy for them to buy this rubric of terrorism for Kashmiri movement. And similar happens for Palestinian struggle as well. So that has to be unpacked. Like, how does it become so easy for the world to buy the rubric of terrorism for a genuine resistance that's happening on ground? And what are the obfuscations that have been created, and what are the impediments that have been created by India in the narrative that they have created in the last 74 years? So these are some of the things that we really have to think about when we think about Kashmir, because till today, although in the last 1 decade, we see that there is a lot of distillation of Kashmiri narrative happening in the international arena. And one of the good things that happened after August 2019 was that the world kind of rose to the fact that this is not just an issue of territory. And that's something that should make us question why was not Kashmir thought of like that before August 5th, 2019? Because there was so much invisibilization and erasure of Kashmiri history that was very easy to buy that this is just a territorial dispute. Once India and Pakistan, they kind of come together and settle down, Kashmiris are going to settle down themselves. But that's not the case. There is a genuine will of the Kashmiri people here. Some 8 million Kashmiris who have been in a constant struggle in different phases from 1947 onwards. It's not just a matter of 2019. It has been happening in different phases, and 2019 kind of brought it to head because at that particular point in time, complete erasure of Kashmir's territorial sovereignty was done unilaterally, undemocratically, unconstitutionally by India, and more so militarily by India. It was a re-annexation of Kashmir, if you will. So the other thing that also happened that should also make us think about how Indigenous rights are being erased as we speak in this moment. Really, it's very hard to keep track of what's happening in Kashmir Day in and day out. And there's so many laws are being changed every day. As we speak, Kashmiris are under technically a martial law because there's no democratically elected government. Now, there I want to take a little pause. When I say democracy inside Kashmir, I'm actually talking about electoral democracy. I'm talking about electoral system. I'm not talking about real democracy. Because if we think through Kashmir's lens and history, there's never been a genuine democracy inside Kashmir. It's always been symbols of democracy that have been weaponized. But again, the client politicians, at least they were local. They would participate in these elections that were predetermined to suit people who were siding with India. They were rigged always. And then they would come to power and kind of like do the governance. But for Kashmiris, it's always been like there is the governance politics, and then there is the Azadi politics, which is the freedom and the independence movement politics. They really see them as two different things. So right now, as we speak, Kashmir is being ruled directly by New Delhi. There is no one, and there is a huge bureaucracy, again, what we see after 2019, that this entire bureaucracy, especially the top management, has been handed over to non-natives. And Kashmiris are kind of the middle management and the clerical staff. And what we see, because the law of domicile was changed after 2019, which is what Kashmiris were holding on to. They were not holding on to autonomy because they loved India or they wanted to establish this relationship and further it with them. They were holding on to it mostly because it was ensuring their sovereignty, and that's completely gone now. And what we see after 2019 is this, the other thing that really connects it to the struggles of Palestinians, of the indigenous peoples here in the US, in Australia, in all other places, is the thinking about resources. Because, you know, indigenous peoples, they have a special relationship with their land. They have a special relationship with everything that grows around them, local food economy, resources, waters, air, everything. But now, after 29, we keep hearing a lot about how India is going to start industries, how India is going to do this and that inside Kashmir. And it gives us it gives the international community this ideal that they're going to develop Kashmir. But when we think through the lens of indigenous peoples, development usually is destruction. Development usually brings in a lot of violence. And India already has had a destructive and extractive relationship with Kashmiri land, especially water, especially all other resources, even quote unquote tourism, so to speak. So that extractive economy is going to be on steroids now. How that's going to affect Kashmir's climate and environment, which is already under much danger and risk, and people are already raising alarms who are looking at this region. What is that going to do to the local economy and the local ecology is only, I mean, time doesn't have to tell, because right now, when we think about Kashmir, even if we think about the number of military installations, if we were to bring them all together, they are the size of the city of Dallas. That's what you have inside Kashmir. That is the densest and heaviest militarization in the entire world. Same goes for the highest battlefield. So Kashmir has these standards in militarization, which are really, you know, makes it one of the most beautiful prisons and in the world. That's what it's called. So thinking about all of these things that are happening after 2019, the other thing that I do want to talk about is the law of no return. So what happened after 2019? India, it was erasing whatever leftover laws were there. And we have to consider that 2019, when the autonomy was taken away militarily, it didn't go away and everything went away. Everything had already been taken away. It was just a nominal thing. Just the territorial sovereignty was staying there. So, but they took the domicile law away. Now anyone can come inside India and from India and stay inside Kashmir and, you know, have the right to franchise and have the right to property. And we do have to make a clarification there that Indians had always had property. There were different kinds of rules that allowed them to do, but they did not have the same permanent status as Kashmiris did. So what India took away is the law of no return. So that's something that we need to consider. And then it's also making larger laws inside India, which is also stopping the return of any kind of Muslim refugee, so to speak. Even thinking through Afghanistan right now, like, would they be welcome inside Kashmir inside India because of the CAA? So the law of no return is any Kashmiri refugees who have moved to Pakistan from 1947 to 1954, they are barred from coming back into Kashmir, which is the law of rightful return is not there. So until 2019, many of the scholars who were studying, you know, Kashmir critically, they were trying to tell the world that this is a problem of settler colonialism. This is a problem of indigenous rights. This is a crisis of solidarity. But the problem was that not a lot of people, because of the obfuscation that had happened in the last 70 years, not many people were ready to kind of reconnect with history and understand it through that lens. But I think 2019 made it easier because India is doing, because of the right-wing government or whatever you want to call it. Before they would do the same things discreetly, but this government kind of is unapologetic of its patriotic, hyper-nationalist state. So they're kind of like going ahead and doing what they need to do. So through that rubric, what's happened is that now we kind of see it brazenly. We see these things and we do hear the echoes of Palestine in here. And we do know that they're changing laws in the most brazen ways so that the indigenous people, the Kashmiri natives, and of all shades, of all colors, of all creeds, of all religions, are really being subsumed under those laws. And so that's basically the erasure that's happened on all fronts, be it economic. And let's think about the cultural erasure. Let's think about cultural imperialism that's happening inside Kashmir that has been stealthily working for the last 70 years. But now, very recently, this is a very trivial, not a trivial example, but a smaller example because Kashmiris kind of overcame that. Just the regular winter robe that Kashmiris wear. That was kind of banned from places. So you kind of like see the echoes of the indigeneity that is being subsumed, the unique cultural expressions that Kashmiris have. And the onslaught happens on languages as well. So we see Hindi being permeated inside Kashmir. So the thing is that I'm an anthropologist. I don't hate culture. No culture is to be hated. I think cultures are beautiful, but we have to let people choose, let people have what influences they want. We don't have to impose things on them. So on the World Indigenous Peoples Day, I think that's what we have to reconnect with, that people's they need grassroots democracy. Peoples don't need these big countries and their rubrics and their impositions and tyrannies wrecking on them. But we really do have to think about what this new social contract between people and their land will look like. And I think we really need to rethink Kashmir through that lens. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Zia. I definitely learned so much from what you shared with us, and I'm very grateful to have heard from you and with all of your background and knowledge that you have. We do want to give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions that they may have. And so if anyone has any questions, definitely feel free to put them in the chat. I did get some questions while you were speaking. And so if you'd be kind enough to take them. The first question for you, Professor, is what's your view about the indigeneity claim of the Hindu people in Kashmir?
So what's my view? They're indigenous people. Can you
Yeah, what's your view about the indigeneity claim of the Hindu people in Kashmir?
They are as indigenous as Kashmiri Muslims. They come from the same ethnic stock. Till 11th, 10th century, Kashmir was heavily Buddhist. It was animistic. It was, they didn't call themselves Hindu. They called themselves Pandit because it has a different history and why they were called Pandits. Mostly it was Brahmanism. So that's what was followed inside Kashmir before they kind of diversified. More so, Islam has been very sort of like the way from 10th to 15th century as we see it kind of expanding. It has been more to create an egalitarian society, and the way it comes into Kashmir, that's a different history. But these people are from the same ethnic stock, so to speak. So there's no question of me having an opinion on the indigeneity. They're as indigenous as Kashmiri Muslims, as Kashmiri Sikhs, and everyone else.
All right, thank you. And then one more question is, isn't it true that the India law of no return is applied only to Muslim Kashmiris, while Hindus from India are being encouraged and allowed to make home in Kashmir? And I guess, would you agree that this is no different than Israel allowing Jews from all over the world while denying the right of return to the Palestinian people in diaspora? You're muted.
I agree with that. That's you kind of like have to see how it's kind of this creeping. I hate to use the word because I don't mean to say that, but just thinking about Palestinization. Not that we want to make it a word, not that I'm kind of like using it in a positive way. It's the most negative that it can be, but it is something like that. So if you think about the CAA that India is passing and has passed in some parts of, you cannot have Muslim immigrants come in, but immigrants of other faiths can come in. So that's like the larger rubric. And then when you think about the law of no return of refugees from 1947 to 1954 inside Kashmir, so you kind of see how there are two levels of them not coming in. And then you also have to think about there were several other refugee populations inside Kashmir, West Pakistan refugees who have got domicile. There were several other small denominations, not faiths, but just class, let's say, who had come into Kashmir. They were called the Valmikis. At one point in time, Kashmir suffered this crisis of people who would clean and be janitors and stuff like that. So they brought in a quote unquote scavenger population. So they were living, although they would get jobs and stuff like that, but they were not permanent residents. So they have got domicile under the new residence laws or going away of residence laws. So you see, this is like multi-layered dispossession that is happening. So that's what activists, that's what Kashmiri scholars and Kashmir scholars are trying to warn the world, that you have to look at the laws that India is trying to pass on the Indian level, on the their nationwide level, and on the level of what it's doing to Kashmiri domicile law. So right now, if anyone from India wants to come into Kashmir and wants to become, have the same rights as any other indigenous Kashmiri, they just have to say that they have been there for 15 years, or they have some sort, like there's different criteria. And if a bureaucrat takes a longer than 15 days to pass that, to give them the documentation, they're actually fined. That has never happened in a bureaucracy. South Asian bureaucracy, they're behemoths. They're these sluggish behemoths. But in this case, it has to be as fast as possible. And in the last 1 year, I think now, I don't have the exact statistics, but it's more in lakhs that these domicile certificates have been given. So that's something that we need to consider, that this is happening in a very concerted way. And this disenfranchisement is also linked to the idea of greater India. You only have to really, like, if you need those links, I'll just give them to the organizers. You have to look at this this poetry that is read in India. It's called Veer Ras. It's a patriotic sort of poets who write about so they talk about that, how they will go up till Afghanistan. They're kind of like in their mind going to this idea of ancient India, Bharat. So you kind of see this huge swathe that's going to be not Muslim and just Hindu and all of that. So we do have to consider Kashmir as Kashmir only, but then we also have to look at it in the larger anti-Islam and anti-Muslim movements that are happening. But we do have to remember this when we think about these Muslim struggle inside South Asia and thinking about India. We have to think about that Kashmiris are fighting against Indian constitution, and Indian Muslims are fighting within Indian constitution. So that's a big demarcation between the two, but they do share the rubric of anti-Islam, that the movements that are happening inside India right now against Muslims.
Thank you so much for your very thorough answer and for contextualizing it in that way, so we kind of get a more holistic picture. And thank you again for speaking to us today and really providing the background and knowledge that comes with the work that you've done and your scholarship. And I'm sure I can speak for the audience when I say it was definitely very refreshing, and we learned a lot, or at least I learned a lot. And so in transitioning into the next part of our event, we will be announcing the third and second place entries for the art and writing competition. And in third place, we have Hafsa Firdaus's essay called Fight for Freedom, and you should be seeing that up on your screen.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Hafsa, and today I am going to be talking about the problems in Palestine and Kashmir. We do not know how hard it is for people in Palestine and Kashmir, but we know that they face issues that we may never will. People in Palestine are having a hard time because they had to leave their homes to survive. This also happens in Kashmir and many other places around the world. We don't want this to happen. Kashmir and Palestine face severe challenges that we have to stop. I want to stop this by talking to people about this problem and telling them that we should find a way to stop this. One day, I hope I can become president and put a stop to this, so there is justice in this world for once. Together, we can put a stop to this. I feel like this is wrong. Nobody should be hurt for no reason. Some people think putting a stop to this is impossible, but I know one day we will have justice in this world. There are problems in Palestine and many other places, and we should do something to help. But I feel like we are doing nothing. Watching so many people suffer breaks my heart. I understand it is hard to live in an environment with so much violence and many rights taken away from you. I can't ignore something so big that has caused a problem. Many people in this world fight over small things in their daily life, not knowing the bigger problems that happen in the outside world. Many people may not understand because they don't know how it is to be in a place until they experience that. We're all humans, so we should not fight against each other. We are all the same, but this doesn't mean that we should compare ourselves to each other. We were created like this, but we shouldn't hurt people because of that. That is not right, and we should be thankful for what we have. I pray to Allah every day to free all indigenous people from all around the world. Thank you.
Mashallah, that was such a lovely essay to hear from one of our youth. And in second place, we have another essay by Zainab Firdos, and the essay is titled Liberty and Justice.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Zainab, and today I'm going to be talking about the issues that are happening in Palestine and Kashmir. The struggle some people are going through is something we might never face in our lives. Throughout Palestine and Kashmir, there are people facing hardships. Israel and Palestine are fighting for Jerusalem. Many people are injured and are dying. Words can't describe the pain I feel for some of these people. The conditions they are living in, with violence around them, is terrifying. We are human beings with our differences, going on with our daily lives. Why do we decide to hurt and harm one another? The question that is asked, but no one gives an answer. Sometimes justice is never served unless someone does something about it. People in Palestine deserve freedom and justice. Since 1948 to present day 2021, Israel and Palestine have been at war for 73 long years. The frequent problem people are facing include hunger, poverty, and no right to return to their homes. Every single day, people are injured. People lose their homes. People lose their lives and lose their right to come back to their home. Where is humanity? Only a few people come up to help these Palestinians who are suffering. Only a few people who speak out for them. People in Kashmir are also going through a rough time. India has been enforcing settler colonialism against Kashmir. Settler colonialism is when people who have been living in the land for many years are forced to leave because other people want to take the land. Many people have died and are severely injured. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect them during this hard time and ease their pain. The way
All right. Mashallah, seeing all of these youth entries and seeing the amazing work that they've put out is very inspiring to me. Alhamdulillah, I'm glad that we have young people in our community who are very passionate about these issues and who are aware and want to fight for justice and against the perils of settler colonialism. So it's definitely very heartwarming to see. And with that, we'll transition to the next part of our presentation. We have speaking to us today, Brother Tahir Herzallah from American Muslims for Palestine. He is somebody that I've had the pleasure and honor of working with closely in AMP. He is the Associate Director of Outreach and Community Organizing for American Muslims for Palestine. He coordinates AMP's grassroots organizing efforts and helps facilitate national coalition building. He's also working to develop AMP's chapters across the country, and he's one of the Irvine 11, which was a group of students who were arrested and prosecuted for expressing their constitutionally protected rights of free speech and political dissent when they walked out of a speech given by the Israeli ambassador Michael Oren at UC Irvine in 2010. Tahir was also one of 6 people arrested for protesting the appointment of David Friedman as the US ambassador to Israel at a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing in February 2017. And he will be speaking to us today about the century-long struggle for freedom in Palestine. Palestinians have been engaged in a constant struggle to preserve their rights and achieve national liberation. Through a variety of tactics, maneuvers, and sheer tenacity, the Palestinian people refuse to be erased by global and regional powers. And despite more than 100 years of settler colonialism, the Palestinian people maintain a strong national identity and presence. And so his presentation will explore how this came to be and the circumstances that led to the global movement to free Palestine. Welcome, Brother Tahir.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I begin in the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful. May the peace and blessings be upon His last and final messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. I want to begin by thanking ICNA for organizing this extraordinary webinar and very informative on some of the longest occupations in our modern times. I also want to thank Dr. Zia for her A-rate presentation, truly astounding information and background to a cause that I thought I knew somewhat about, but now I realize I'm very surface level in my understanding of how deep Kashmir's struggle for liberation is. Palestine, an issue that has captured the attention of the world over the past several decades. Palestine, a cause that refuses to die despite the numerous efforts by very powerful enemies. Palestine, the cause of those people around the world who are struggling against colonization and imperialism. Palestine, the vanguard against Western encroachment of the Muslim world. Palestine, the cause for Muslims around the world who see it as a religious and spiritual hub, as the first Qibla, as the second mosque built on earth, as the land of the prophets and messengers. Palestine, in all of these essences, remains till today and will continue to be the flagship, the point of reference, so to speak, for anti-colonial movements. And when the history books are written, surely this struggle, for how long it has lasted, will be remembered as one of the most enduring and persevering struggles of human history. I wanted to give a background today about Palestine, but not starting with Israel as a point of reference, because Israel's 1948 creation is not where Palestine's struggle for liberation began. In fact, Palestine's struggle for liberation and the preservation of national unity began far, far before that. And I want to go back as far as 1799, when Napoleon invaded Egypt and parts of the Middle East. And upon his entry, he declared to Jews in Europe at the time, particularly in France, that he wanted them to move to Palestine. And his strategic objective at the time was to build a bulwark of support for France's imperial interests in the region by doing two things. Number one, dealing with his own Jewish problem in France, because Jews in Europe have been looked down upon for centuries and have been systematically ethnically cleansed and oppressed. And from his perspective, he saw this as a way out. And number two, to maintain a strong support of a community against British interests in the region, as Britain was his main imperial competitor at the time. Of course, Napoleon's efforts failed. In 1799, his occupation of Egypt was very short-lived, but that did, in essence, start the first proto-Zionist initiative to place European Jews into historic Palestine in order to serve the interests of Western Empire. And Napoleon was not the only Western imperial leader to make this suggestion. As a matter of fact, afterwards, the German emperor, as well as the Austro-Hungarian and even the Russian Tsar, made initiatives to remove their own Jewish populations and send them to Palestine. So much to the point where the Russian emperor made a statement so as that we don't want to get rid of all the Jews, just the sick and destitute among them. And he sent a letter to the Ottoman Sultan to encourage him or to convince him to allow the migration of Jews to historic Palestine. So these initiatives began way before the advent of the term Zionism, which was coined by Nathan Birnbaum, and way before the first Zionist conference took place in Switzerland, at the helm of or led by Theodor Herzl, who had wrote the book The Jewish State in 1895. So we're talking about many years of initiatives led by European imperialists to colonize Palestine, to inject a foreign population into Palestine, and essentially create a geopolitical fort, so to speak, in support of imperial interests in the region. And this is all because of the demise of the Ottoman Empire in its final days, as the Ottoman Empire lost more land in its last 150 years of existence. European powers sought to essentially work to divvy up the land of the Middle East and what we call Southwest Asia, North Africa today, the Swana region. And we saw many agreements among European powers themselves to divvy up this land that the Ottoman Empire had under their control. One of the more famous ones is the Sykes-Picot agreement that was made between the British and the French to divvy up the land of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, and essentially give those lands or hold dominion over those lands from the British and the French. The French took Syria, Lebanon. The British took Iraq, Palestine, Jordan. And this was an effort to, of course, maintain control over natural resources, exploit labor, and as well as to advance the colonial interests in the region. But what's the interesting story in this case, and this is something that I really relate to Dr. Zia's presentation about, is when we're talking about the struggle, the indigenous struggle for liberation, because the Palestinian people have been engaged in resisting all efforts of colonization since the time of Napoleon till today. The Palestinian people have been engaged in a myriad of tactics to avoid and to obstruct imperial interests in the region, so much to the point where they even revolted against the Ottomans at some point when they felt that there was an initiative to systematically oppress the Palestinian national feeling. And this was a famous revolt that took place after the Tanzimat era, in Palestine, an Ottoman era of Tanzimat, and where the Ottomans sent a very, very vicious commander to squash the Palestinian uprising in Palestine, and they ended up calling him Al-Jazzar, which today, if you go to Palestine in Akka, in Acre, today you will find a mosque named after him. They call it Masjid Al-Jazzar. This is something of our history. So the Palestinian people have been engaged in a resistance against any imperial or colonial entity, whether it was European or in this case Ottoman. This is part of the story, and I want us to appreciate that when we talk about Palestinian nationhood, it's not necessarily reliant on the establishment of a nation state. That Palestinian nationhood, it has existed for more than a century. The concept of a Palestinian people. A very good book by Noor Masalha that I would highly recommend. A Palestinian British historian wrote a book called Palestine, a 4,000-year history. And it talks about the idea of Palestinian and how that came to be. And I think this is very illustrative of the way that things played out from 1917, from the infamous declaration, Balfour Declaration, where the British Empire officially committed itself to the establishment of a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine. This is the language that's been used, almost verbatim. Okay, and from that moment till today, we see that there has been a constant struggle against British imperialism and through its proxies, Zionist settler colonialism. And so the British took control of Palestine after World War I, as I mentioned, after the Sykes-Picot Agreement between the British and the French. They called it the Palestine Mandate, and essentially lasted for approximately 30 years, from about 1920s to 1947. And the Balfour Declaration was made at the height of World War I, before even British troops had took over Palestine. But the British were already making plans for Palestine, which included the establishment of a Jewish homeland. So on one hand, the British colonized Palestine as they colonized India. But on the other hand, they were involved in a nation-building project for Jews coming from Europe. And so you had these two parallel projects that were taking place, that were led by the British, that essentially denied Palestinians the ability to establish their own state after the demise of the Ottoman Empire, while at the same time empowering and building the infrastructure for the establishment of a Jewish state on the land of historic Palestine. And so similarly to what happened with Kashmir, the United Nations and the advent of the United Nations took place after World War II, decided to come with a proposal to partition Palestine, where the large majority of the land would be given to the recent incoming Zionist settlers at the expense of the minority of the land given to the majority of the indigenous Palestinian people, and of course, without the consultation of the Palestinian people or Arab leaders at the time, and was forcefully and viciously rejected by the Palestinian people. And this was one of several partition plans and suggestions made by both the League of Nations and the United Nations. And this is another thing that I wanted to point to, that international institutions such as the United Nations have played a role from the beginning of their existence in subduing the Palestinian people, in preventing Palestinians from achieving their statehood, and from continuing the subjugation of Palestinians by the state of Israel through continuing the process of aid, which we have seen has been destructive for the Palestinian society, which has made Palestinians reliant on international community support to just merely sustain their lives, sustain a living, to eat and drink water, while not giving them their full rights to establish their own homeland and essentially create a future for themselves. So this is the situation that we've been dealing with since the British Mandate was established, and then the United Nations Partition Plan, and then we see the forced settler colonization of Palestine over a span of nearly 100 years before the State of Israel is established. The first Zionist settlements in Palestine began in the 1850s, where it was clear that they had an agenda to take large hectares of land in Palestine and transform them to Jewish colonies. But the first phases of Zionist settlement in Palestine were not as ideological as the latter phases of Zionist settlement, which took place really in the early 1900s till 1947, in the third and fourth and fifth aliyahs, where it was clear that the objective was to remove the indigenous Palestinian population, to take the land of the indigenous Palestinian population, make it exclusively run and designed for Jewish settlers, and essentially economically disenfranchise the indigenous Palestinian farmers and laborers who were working those lands, some for over 400 years and many, many generations. And so this inevitably caused conflict between the two communities during the British Mandate period, which, like I said, it took place from about 1922 to 1947, and caused several strikes and riots and incidents that took place. One of the most famous ones was the Buraq uprising of 1929, which took place in Jerusalem. And Palestinians rose up against what they felt was, at that time, an encroachment on Palestinian Muslim spaces, such as Masjid al-Aqsa, by Jewish settlers who were trying to take exclusive rights to the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, to worship at the Western Wall, and which caused a major flare-up in tensions between the two communities. And when the British then decided at that point, after a commission report, that they wanted to restrict Jewish migration to Palestine moving forward. And that is where the highly armed and militarized Zionist communities of Palestine decided to take things into their own hands by fighting the British policies of limiting migration to Palestine through the engagement of terrorist acts. We saw the establishment of terrorist organizations like the Irgun and Stern Gang, which ended up, after the establishment of the State of Israel, becoming part of the Israeli military, becoming the Israeli military in essence. And they attacked both British and Palestinians working the land, the Palestinian indigenous people who lived on the land, essentially beginning the ethnic cleansing process even before the State of Israel was established in 1948. So when we talk about the removal of Palestinians, there were incidents where Marj Sall al-Amr, for example, this is in the 1930s, where 6,000 Palestinians were removed from their homes and their homeland because the Jewish National Fund purchased land from absentee owners of the land and did not want any Palestinians living on the land, and essentially began the removal process immediately of Palestinians. And this, of course, caused more tension. So we're talking about a process of ethnic cleansing and removal and genocide that has been taking place for close to 100 years now of the Palestinian population. And so when we talk about Zionism, the ideology that essentially is the founding base of the State of Israel, established and came to fruition in Europe in the context of European colonialism, which seeks to establish a homeland for Jews exclusively at the expense of the Palestinian people in Palestine, we realize that Zionism is inextricably tied to Western imperialism and colonialism, that its interests are tied with those, and that we cannot separate the two projects from each other. That when we look at Zionism and Islamophobia, and this is another topic that we can discuss, of course, that these are also combined and connected to each other, because it is in Israel's interest to dehumanize the Palestinian population, as India has been dehumanizing the Kashmiri population and Muslims in general in India, in order to justify their occupation and colonization and policies in those lands. And that's another subject that we can have an entire discussion about. But this is also tied to the history of imperialism in the region, and how European armies and colonizers have seen and projected an image of Islam and Muslims to the rest of the world in order to justify their inquisitions and their occupations of Muslim lands around the region. So I'll end it with that, and I'll be happy to take questions. I know I went into a broader historical discussion, but I thought it was very important to give some context and background rather than getting into the modern day nitty gritty, which I'll be more than happy to get into with question and answer.
Jazakallah khair. So I had definitely learned a lot. As much as I feel I know about Palestine, I definitely learned a lot from what you had to share with us. So thank you for that historical context. If people have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We did get one question so far, and it says, should the oft referred to term of British mandate be actually British occupation? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, it was the British occupation of Palestine, and it was clear from the objective of from the standpoint of the British that they were there to colonize and to take advantage of the land and the resources of Palestine in order to achieve their interests. One of the things that I found very interesting is the story of General Allenby as he was entering Palestine, and the statement that he made as he was entering Jerusalem, and it was recorded in a newspaper, a British newspaper at the time, where General Allenby, as he was marching into Jerusalem with the British army behind him, said that finally the Crusades are over, and they had entered Palestine on Christmas Day, and it was being hailed in British newspapers as a Christmas miracle, that this is a sign from God that Christianity has come to dominate Islam once again.
All right, and another question that we received in the chat is if you could talk a little bit about the ongoing situation in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, and how people in those neighborhoods have demonstrated their courage and resistance, and maybe what we in America can learn from them.
Absolutely. The situation in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan is a very hot situation right now as it's taking place, and it's part of a larger process of what we call the Judaization of Jerusalem, particularly East Jerusalem, but it's part of a larger plan that the Israelis have been putting in place over the past decade to increase the amount of Jewish settlers in Jerusalem and decrease the amount of Palestinians in order to create a demographic majority in Jerusalem, in order to create what they call a unified city, a quote unquote unified Jewish capital that essentially removes Palestinians entirely. And Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan are two important neighborhoods because they sit in a strategic location that Israel cannot forfeit if it wants to achieve its objective of a unified city. And therefore, those communities are under attack. Currently, the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah is threatened with ethnic cleansing and expulsion. The several families have already been expelled And it's interesting because in Silwan, there's a difference between the situation in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah. In Sheikh Jarrah, the Israelis do not seek to destroy the Palestinian homes. In fact, they seek to take over Palestinian homes and allow Israeli settlers to come and live in them. But the argument that the Israelis make to the Palestinians, which is very interesting in the Israeli court system, is that the houses of Sheikh Jarrah were built without permits and are therefore there illegally. So that when the families petitioned them back, they said, okay, well, what, do you want us to destroy the houses and get permits to build the houses again? They said, no, we want you to leave the houses. So if the issue was about permits, then it would have been easily resolved. But the problem is it's not about the permits about the houses being built. It's about the Palestinians living there that the Israelis want to remove and, of course, populate the houses with Israeli settlers. And you saw the famous video of this Zionist, I call him Zionist pig, who lives in one of the family's houses in Muhammad al-Kurd's house, essentially squatting on their land with the protection of the Israeli military. So this is not some random ragtag group of people who are occupying the lands. This is a full state policy, a systemic ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people of Sheikh Jarrah. And now we're waiting to see what happens with the next court decision. There has been a stall or halt on the removal of the Palestinian families of Sheikh Jarrah. We're hoping this is because of the pressure that we have been applying here in the United States. Now, the situation in Silwan is different. In Silwan, the Israeli military wants to completely erase the neighborhood. We're talking about thousands of people being displaced from an entire neighborhood. In order to do what? In order to build a religious theme park. They are going to make people homeless during a pandemic because they want to build a religious theme park. And it's absurd that this is not being covered more in Western media as Sheikh Jarrah was, mainly because I think Silwan does not have an eloquent Muhammad al-Kurd to speak on its behalf. But this is the situation that the Palestinian families in Silwan are dealing with, and they are resisting this, although Israel has already commenced with the destruction of several Palestinian homes and businesses in Silwan, and will continue a systematic process of destruction of the entire neighborhood until all those Palestinians are removed and ethnically cleansed from there. So that's the update on the situation there. We are following it closely, and we are planning actions around the country over the rest of this month, actually, for the next 8 days, to stop the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem.
All right, and then we have another question from an audience member. And the question broadly states, what's your opinion on the Ottoman Empire? But I don't know if you want to contextualize that to in relation to like the Palestinian issue or Palestinian struggle.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that one of the primary defense mechanisms against Zionist colonization of Palestine in that period was the Ottoman Sultan. He played an important role, Abdul Hamid II, to prevent Jewish colonization of Palestine in a very big way by rejecting multiple offers from different Western powers and the Zionist movement themselves, who offered him large sums of money actually to sell parts of Palestine, and he absolutely refused. And then some wealthy, well-to-do Zionists began purchasing Palestinian land despite the rejection of the Ottomans to the presence of any colonial entity in Palestine. Although I think that in some ways the position in the last days of the Ottoman Empire weakened the Palestinian position because of the fact that Palestinian society, the way it was composed at the time, was part of a larger Levant region Arab group. So many Palestinians at the time, in the early 1900s, were petitioning to join the newly established Syrian state, that they felt that it was part of our our culture and tradition, that we have similar cultural practices. That if we were going to be establishing a nation state as demanded by the this post Westphalian era that we live in today, in this global order, then we might as well join with another Arab state. And so the demise of the Ottoman Empire unfortunately expedited the colonization of Palestine, and gave the European powers the ability to do what they wanted with Palestine. The problem that we had in Palestine, though, in the 1800s, in the last century of Ottoman rule, is that Palestine was not in a good state. We had immense poverty, we had immense economic crises, droughts and famines. Palestine was in a situation where people began to revolt against the Ottoman rule because of these situations there. And so it definitely did not help when European colonizers arrived and began taking advantage of the situation, that the position of the Ottomans was so weak in Palestine. And so but like other European powers, the Ottomans also were not interested in the national aspirations of Palestinian people, because they sought to control Palestine as well. So there's a nuanced history to it. We cannot say it was a Muslim empire that we needed to support. Yeah, I mean there's elements of that, but we also have to look at the nuances and see in fact what happened that led to the demise of the Ottoman Empire, and essentially allowed the European powers to take advantage of the situation.
All right, thank you so much, Tahir, and thank you for everyone who put in your questions. We are not going to have time for any more questions, but I think we thank you, Tahir, for the very comprehensive background that you shared with us, and I'm really framing and contextualizing the Palestinian issue, as something that existed pre-1948. I think it's easy for many of us to just think of Palestine and think of 48. So we definitely appreciated that larger historical context. And from here, we will be transitioning to announcing the first place entry to our art and writing competition. And that will be, the first place entry is a poem by Maryam Sarhan called Once Upon an Injustice. And you should be seeing that on your screens.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Maryam Sarhan, and I'm going to be reciting a shortened version of my poem, Once Upon an Injustice. Let me tell you the story of people who are prey to colonization. The ending may not yet be one of glory, but someday the world will come to realization. Imagine a man coming to your door with guns the size of a child, says, "Get on the floor, here to attack, occupy, exile." Imagine the sounds of gunshots being familiar to your ears. Bombs drop, people die, and it's just considered collateral damage. Children living each and every day in fear. It's a war, but you never have the advantage. I wish this were only an imagination, that it could be expelled with a mere enough. This immense tyranny, this blatant violation, is the everyday life of people living under occupation. They struggle each and every day to overcome, while the oppressors are given a standing ovation. The people of Palestine, whose very existence is challenged. Their lands and homes stolen day after day, brutally murdered, their lives not considered valid, and every day they hope for a change. Their crime is existing, and they don't even get a fair trial. While the oppressors are persisting, the world is in denial. Stealing is a crime until it's Palestinians who are being wronged. Murder is beastly until it's a Palestinian child. Eviction is unethical until it's a Palestinian family. Family separation is devastating until it's a child who has to watch her parents die before her very eyes. And across the world, people in power supply them with the weapons and feed everyone ruthless lies. What's acceptable about decades of genocide? But for every bomb that drops on that beautiful place and people, for every grain of sand that borders the Dead Sea, is a Palestinian who's seen and been through so much, but still has hope and faith in humanity. The soil is soaked with tears of hope, fear, and despair, but from that soil grows many an olive tree. With arms stretching far into the air, they may be physically in chains, but their hearts are free. and I wish this were the only case of colonization. But there seems to be no end to the tyrannic occupation. Listen, O people, and you shall hear of the devastating story of occupied Kashmir. On the 5th of August in 2019, unraveled an unfortunate, unjust scene. Kashmir was taken under siege. Their basic human rights stripped from them. No access to supplies or communication, as the world dismissed this cruel violation. So let me tell you the story. And I know we're 1,000 chapters in. The title was unpleasant, many moments were dim. Blood soaks the cover, and so many people died. But this tale isn't over yet. There are still characters inside who possess wills of iron and hearts of steel. They laugh into the face of the oppressors, persist as they murder and steal. This story won't be over until the true villains are revealed. It's not once upon a time, it's once upon a reality. Many an injustice, many a crime. So even if it takes an eternity, there will come a time where the oppressed and silenced will ascend, and they will take back their birthright before we see the words, the end.
All right. Thank you to everyone for joining us today and learning about the similarities between, the two ongoing occupations. And thank you to our speakers for enlightening us about the historical context and the nuances in these current struggles for liberation of the people in Kashmir and Palestine. And also, very proud of all of the contestants in the competition, and congratulations to everyone whose work we saw today. I want to let everybody know that a recording of this webinar will be posted on ICNA CSJ's site and on the YouTube channel. And in closing, we will be having a dua by Brother Ziad.
اللهم اشف مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين وارحم موتانا وموتى المسلمين وارحم موتانا وموتى المسلمين وارحم موتانا وموتى المسلمين اللهم انصر إخواننا في كل مكان اللهم انصر إخواننا في فلسطين وفي كشمير وفي هند وفي أفغانستان وفي كل مكان ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Ameen. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope that you have a lovely rest of your day, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.